Michael Carter had been gone from his lake house for exactly 14 months, and not one of those months had been easy. His mother had been dying slowly in a hospital bed 3 states away, and every week he had told himself he would go home soon, just as soon as things settled. Things never settled. He paid his property taxes online without ever seeing the house. He kept the water and electricity running at the lowest possible rate, just enough to protect the pipes through winter. He set his homeowners association dues to auto-pay, the same $70 a month, leaving his account like clockwork, a small quiet promise that the house was still his and always would be. No one else had a key. No one else had permission to set foot inside. The lake house had been his refuge for 8 years, a place he had bought with the earnings from a decade of independent architectural work, a place where he sketched blueprints on the porch while loons called across the water at dusk. He loved that house the way some men love an old truck or a childhood dog, with a loyalty that did not need explaining to anyone. When his mother finally passed, grief and exhaustion sat on his chest like 2 stones, but underneath the sorrow was something steady, a small flicker of relief that he could finally go home. The drive back took 11 hours, and Michael spent most of it in silence, watching the highway markers count down the miles to the lake. When he finally turned onto the gravel road that led to his driveway, the late afternoon sun was slanting gold across the water, exactly the way he remembered it. For one brief moment, everything felt normal. Then his headlights swept across the front gate, and normal ended. The electric gate that once opened with a code only he knew was now sealed behind a keypad displaying a different 4-digit sequence, one he had never programmed. He sat in his car staring at it, certain he had simply forgotten, though he knew, somewhere underneath the fatigue, that he had not. He tried his old code twice. The gate refused to move. A small red light blinked back at him like a warning. He parked outside the fence and walked the rest of the way, and that was when the second shock hit him. The house itself, once painted a warm sandy beige that matched the shoreline, had been repainted a crisp navy blue with white trim, a color scheme he never would have chosen, and certainly never approved. Fresh mulch lined the flower beds. New shutters hung on the windows. Someone had spent real money transforming his home into something unrecognizable, and they had done it without a single phone call, a single letter, a single word of warning. Michael stood frozen on the walkway, his suitcase still in his hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The security cameras he had installed years earlier, the ones that used to blink a small green light near the eaves, were simply gone, their mounting brackets left bare against the siding like empty eye sockets. Even the wooden sign that once hung by the mailbox, hand-carved with his family name, had vanished without a trace, replaced by nothing at all, as though someone had wanted every marker of his identity erased from the property. His stomach tightened as he rounded the side of the house toward the garage, and there, parked confidently in the very spot where his own car used to sit, was a gleaming silver SUV that did not belong to him. The vehicle looked expensive, freshly washed, the kind of car that announced money and confidence in equal measure. Michael felt something cold slide down his spine, a recognition that whatever was happening here was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. Someone had moved into his life while he was 3 states away holding his mother's hand, and they had made themselves very comfortable indeed. He pulled his old brass key from his pocket, the same key he had carried in his wallet for 8 years, worn smooth from handling. His fingers trembled slightly as he slid it toward the front door lock, some instinct telling him this simple act would not go the way it should. Before the key even touched the metal, the door swung open from the inside, and Michael found himself staring directly into the face of a stranger standing in the doorway of his own home. The woman looked to be in her mid-50s, dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks, her silver blonde hair cut into a severe, expensive bob. She held herself with the posture of someone who had never once doubted her own authority, chin lifted, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing at Michael as though he were an intruder caught mid-crime. For a long, strange moment, neither of them spoke, the lake breeze drifting between them, carrying the scent of fresh paint and cut grass. Then the woman's expression shifted from suspicion to something colder, something closer to disgust, and she reached into her blazer pocket for her phone. Michael opened his mouth to explain himself, to say this was his house, his key, his life, but the woman was already dialing, her thumb moving with practiced speed. She lifted the phone to her ear and locked eyes with him the entire time, daring him to move, daring him to run. Her voice, when it came, was calm and clipped, the voice of someone who had made this exact call before and knew precisely how to sound believable. She told the dispatcher there was a man attempting to break into her home, that he was standing on her porch with a key trying to force his way inside, that she needed officers sent immediately. Michael stood there in stunned silence, suitcase still gripped in his hand, listening to a stranger describe him as a criminal in the exact spot where he had once watched sunsets with his late father. What the woman did not know, what she could not have known standing there in her borrowed confidence, was that Michael's name was still listed on every single piece of paperwork that mattered. His name sat on the deed recorded at the county courthouse. His name sat on the mortgage statements, the property tax bills, the insurance policy, the homeowners association account that had been auto-paying dues every single month he was gone. And the woman standing in his doorway, the one accusing him of trespassing on land he legally owned, happened to be the president of his own homeowners association. Her name, Michael would soon learn, was Linda Harper, and she had been living inside his house for the better part of a year. The woman who introduced herself moments later as Linda Harper stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching Michael the way a hawk watches something small moving through grass. She was 55 years old, though she carried herself with the rigid confidence of someone who believed age had earned her the right to control every square inch of her surroundings. As president of the Lakeshore Ridge Homeowners Association, she had spent nearly a decade building a reputation that most residents whispered about rather than spoke of openly, because everyone in the neighborhood understood one basic rule: you did not cross Linda Harper. She took one long look at Michael's travel-worn jacket, his tired eyes, the suitcase still clutched in his hand, and decided instantly that he was beneath her attention. Her voice dropped into a tone she likely used on landscapers and delivery drivers, sharp and dismissive, the kind of voice that assumed obedience before the sentence even finished. She told him plainly that he was not permitted to stand on the porch, that this was private property, and that he needed to step back onto the walkway immediately. Michael, still processing the sight of his own home wearing someone else's colors, let out a short, disbelieving laugh before he could stop himself. He told her, as calmly as his exhaustion allowed, that he lived there, that this was his house, that he had owned it for 8 years. Linda's lips curled into something between amusement and contempt, and she laughed back at him, a short, humorless sound that echoed off the freshly painted siding. She told him, with total certainty, that he most definitely did not live there anymore. According to Linda, the property had been abandoned for over a year, left to rot with no visible owner, no maintenance, no sign of life. She claimed the homeowners association had been forced to step in and take responsibility for the property, citing violations, unpaid obligations, and community safety concerns. She said the neighborhood board had voted, unanimously, she insisted, to allow her temporary stewardship of the home until an owner could be properly identified. Every single word of it was fabricated, built from nothing, but she delivered the lie with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had told it many times before. Michael tried again, his voice steadier now, explaining that he had never abandoned the property, that he had paid every tax bill and every HOA fee without missing a single payment, that he had simply been caring for his dying mother out of state. Linda's expression did not soften even slightly. If anything, his explanation seemed to irritate her further, as though the truth were an inconvenience standing between her and the story she preferred. She told him she did not have time for excuses, that she had already called the authorities, and that he would need to explain himself to the police when they arrived. True to her word, within minutes the quiet lakeside road filled with the low hum of an approaching engine, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Michael turned to see a single patrol car pulling up near the gate, its lights not yet flashing. The officer inside clearly expecting a routine trespassing call rather than anything complicated. Linda's posture straightened even further at the sight of the vehicle, and something like satisfaction flickered across her face, the look of a woman who believed the system existed entirely to validate her. She stepped forward to meet the officer before he had even fully exited his car, her voice suddenly warm and cooperative in a way it had never been with Michael. She gestured toward him with practiced concern, calling him a stranger who had shown up uninvited trying to force his way into her home with a stolen key. The officer's eyes moved between the two of them, taking in Linda's composed authority and Michael's road-weary appearance, and for a moment, Michael understood exactly how this was going to look from the outside. As the officer stepped out of his vehicle, a second patrol car rolled up behind the first, its headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Michael stood at the edge of his own driveway, watching two uniformed officers approach the woman who had stolen his house, and he felt, for the first time since arriving, a genuine flicker of fear that no one was going to believe him at all. Linda Harper handled the two officers the way a seasoned performer handles an audience, shifting effortlessly between warmth and outrage depending on who she was addressing. She smiled at the taller officer, a man named Officer Daniels, thanking him for arriving so quickly and expressing how frightened she had been standing alone in her own home when a stranger appeared on her porch. She reached into a small drawer just inside the doorway and produced a set of keys, holding them up as evidence, explaining that these were the keys to the house she had lived in for over a year. She followed the keys with a folder of documents she seemed to have prepared in advance, as though she had anticipated this exact confrontation long before it happened. Inside were recent internet bills addressed to her name at the lake house address, along with printed emails from the Homeowners Association discussing property maintenance and community updates. She handed over a folded letter on official-looking HOA letterhead, describing her as the current resident responsible for the property's upkeep. Everything she presented looked polished, organized, and entirely convincing to two officers who had no way of knowing the paper trail had been built on lies. Officer Daniels flipped through the documents with a neutral expression, occasionally glancing toward Michael, who stood several feet away holding nothing but an old brass key and a driver's license with an out-of-state address on it. Michael's own proof felt embarrassingly thin by comparison. A worn key that matched a lock Linda had likely changed months ago, and a photocopy of an old property tax statement he had grabbed from his car in a hurry. He explained, as clearly as he could manage, that he had been out of state caring for his dying mother, that he had paid every bill remotely, that this woman had no legal right to be inside his home at all. Linda interrupted him repeatedly, her voice rising just enough to sound urgent without tipping into hysteria, a calculated performance she had clearly perfected. Every time Michael tried to finish a sentence, she cut across him with a fresh detail, a fresh complaint, a fresh reminder to the officers that she was the one who had called for help. The officers, caught between two competing stories and unable to verify property records standing in the dark on a gravel driveway, made the only decision that seemed reasonable in the moment. They asked Michael to step back from the property while they sorted out the paperwork discrepancy, a request that felt, to Michael, like the ground had opened beneath him. He stood at the edge of his own driveway, watching officers his own tax dollars helped fund treat him like a suspicious outsider on land he had owned for nearly a decade. The frustration building inside him was almost unbearable, a hot, helpless anger at watching a woman lie so effortlessly while he, the actual owner, was told to keep his distance. He thought about the years he had spent restoring the porch railing by hand, the mornings he had fished off the dock with his father before his father passed, the quiet nights he had spent designing houses for other people while dreaming of retiring to this very spot. None of that seemed to matter standing here in the dark, reduced to a name the officers could not yet confirm. Just as the tension threatened to boil over completely, Officer Daniels turned back toward Michael with a slightly different look on his face, something more measured than before. He asked for Michael's full legal name again, slower this time, along with his date of birth, and pulled out a small device to check the information against county records. Michael answered clearly, watching the officer's fingers move across the screen, watching his expression shift almost imperceptibly as new information appeared in front of him. For just a moment, Officer Daniels paused, his eyes flicking up from the screen to Michael's face and back again, as though something on the record did not match the confident narrative Linda had been building for the last 10 minutes. It was a small hesitation, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely. But Michael caught it, and something in his chest loosened just slightly. For the first time since pulling into that driveway, he felt the faintest thread of hope that the truth might still find its way to the surface. Michael did not argue further with the officers standing in his driveway, because some quiet instinct told him that raising his voice would only make him look more suspicious, not less. Instead, he stepped a few feet away, pulled out his phone with hands that were not quite steady, and called the one person he trusted more than anyone in moments like this, a real estate attorney named Robert Ellison who had handled his original home purchase 8 years earlier. Robert answered on the second ring, his voice calm and businesslike even at that late hour, and Michael explained the situation in short, clipped sentences, trying to keep the panic out of his own words. Robert's instructions were immediate and precise. He told Michael not to leave the property under any circumstances, not to raise his voice, not to touch anything, and above all, not to sign a single document the officers might present. He said he would begin pulling records immediately and would send everything directly to the responding officers within minutes. County deed information, closing documents, tax history, anything that would establish ownership beyond any reasonable doubt. Michael relayed this to Officer Daniels, who agreed to wait, mostly because Linda's story, despite her confidence, still lacked one crucial thing that Michael's did not: an actual verifiable paper trail from an independent source. Within 15 minutes, Robert's first email arrived on Officer Daniels' phone, a scanned copy of the recorded property deed showing Michael Carter's name as the sole legal owner, filed with the county recorder's office 8 years earlier. Attached beneath it was a printout from the county assessor's website, publicly accessible and impossible to fake, listing the same name, the same address, and an unbroken tax payment history stretching back to the original purchase date. Officer Daniels read through the document slowly, his brow furrowing, and for the first time that evening, he turned his attention fully toward Linda instead of Michael. Linda's composure cracked just slightly at the edges, though she tried to cover it with more volume rather than less. She insisted the documents had to be fabricated somehow, that anyone could forge a deed if they knew what they were doing, that Michael must have found some way to manipulate the records before arriving. Her voice climbed half an octave higher than it had been all evening, and the officers exchanged a brief glance that Michael recognized immediately as skepticism finally taking root. Robert did not stop there. Within another few minutes, a second email arrived containing scanned photographs from the actual closing day 8 years earlier. Michael standing outside the house with a real estate agent, holding a giant ceremonial key beside a sold sign. Behind those came the original mortgage loan documents, complete with Michael's signature notarized on every page, and finally the homeowner's insurance policy listing him as the sole named insured on the property. Each new document landed like another brick in a wall that Linda's story could no longer climb over, no matter how confidently she kept trying. Michael watched the color slowly drain from Linda's face as Officer Daniels scrolled through page after page of evidence that directly contradicted everything she had claimed only 20 minutes earlier. Her jaw tightened, her arms crossed even harder over her chest, and yet she still refused to step back. Still insisted there had to be some explanation that favored her, some technicality the officers were missing. It was the stubbornness of someone who had gotten away with something for a very long time and simply could not process the idea that it might finally be catching up with her. Officer Daniels lowered his phone and looked directly at Linda with an expression far less friendly than the one he had greeted her with earlier. He told her plainly that the county records office had just confirmed independently, through their own dispatch channel, that the deed on file matched exactly what the attorney had sent over. The Homeowners Association's own internal minutes, the property records, and 8 years of consistent ownership all pointed in the same direction, and none of it pointed toward Linda Harper. In the days following that confrontation in the driveway, Robert Ellison did not simply stop at proving ownership. He began digging deeper into county records, court filings, and public complaints, curious about how a woman with no legal claim to the property had managed to convince an entire neighborhood and nearly 2 police officers that she belonged there. What he uncovered painted a picture far darker than a single opportunistic squatter taking advantage of an empty house. Robert discovered that Linda Harper had a documented pattern stretching back several years, a pattern that repeated itself with unsettling precision across the Lakeshore Ridge community. She specifically targeted homes where the owners were absent for extended periods, watching for telltale signs, overgrown lawns, uncollected mail, or long stretches without any lights turning on in the evenings. Once she identified a property that fit the pattern, she moved quickly and quietly, often changing the locks within days and settling in before anyone had the chance to notice. Neighbors who had lived beside these properties for years began speaking up once Robert started asking careful, respectful questions door to door. Several confirmed they had seen unfamiliar furniture being moved into homes whose owners were supposedly traveling, or noticed strange tenants coming and going from houses that should have been empty. It became clear that Linda had been quietly subletting rooms in these properties to short-term boarders, collecting cash payments while wielding her HOA position like a shield against anyone who dared question her. Whenever a suspicious neighbor did work up the courage to ask about the unfamiliar activity, Linda used her authority as association president to shut down the conversation almost instantly. She would cite obscure bylaws, threaten fines for unrelated violations, or simply intimidate people into silence with the implicit understanding that crossing her meant trouble for their own properties down the line. Over time, an entire section of the neighborhood had learned it was simply easier and safer to look away. One elderly resident, a retired school teacher named Grace Whitfield, who had lived in the community for over 20 years, finally approached Michael quietly one afternoon while he stood outside surveying the damage to his own home. She glanced over her shoulder before speaking, her voice lowered as though Linda might somehow hear her from 3 houses down. She told Michael, with a kind of weary sadness in her eyes, that he was not the first person this had happened to, and that others before him had simply given up rather than fight. Grace explained that she knew of at least one other family who returned from an extended trip to find their home altered and occupied, only to be told by Linda that they had somehow forfeited their rights through neglect. Rather than endure the exhausting battle Michael was currently fighting, that family had simply moved away entirely, choosing to sell the property at a steep loss rather than confront Linda Harper directly. Grace admitted with visible shame that she and several other neighbors had known about it at the time and said nothing, afraid of becoming Linda's next target. Robert took Grace's account seriously and began cross-referencing property sale records across the neighborhood from the past several years, searching for a pattern that matched her description. What he found sent a genuine chill through both him and Michael, because it confirmed that Grace's story was not an isolated incident at all. There were at least 3 other properties within the same small lakeside community that had changed hands under strikingly similar circumstances. Owners who left for extended periods only to return to strangers, altered locks, and eventually the decision to simply walk away rather than fight the woman who controlled the neighborhood's homeowners association. As Robert continued building the case against Linda Harper, he requested access to the homeowners association's official records, a request the current board technically could not refuse under state disclosure laws. What he found inside those files revealed a scheme far more calculated than simple opportunistic squatting, something closer to a small, methodical operation built entirely around Linda's control of association paperwork. Meeting minutes, resident votes, and board resolutions had all been quietly manipulated over the years to serve her purposes. Buried within the archived documents were meeting minutes describing votes that, according to Robert's cross-referencing, had simply never taken place. Resolutions granting Linda expanded authority over vacant properties appeared in the official record, dated to meetings that several current board members confirmed, under Robert's careful questioning, they had never actually attended. The signatures attached to these documents, meant to represent unanimous board approval, did not match the handwriting samples Robert obtained from the very members whose names appeared on the page. Even more damning, Robert uncovered a stack of official-looking letters that had been sent to Michael's mailing address over the 14 months he was away, letters he never received because they had apparently never actually been mailed at all. These letters, dated and signed as though sent directly from the homeowners association, claimed to notify Michael of code violations and eventual property forfeiture proceedings due to prolonged neglect. In reality, they existed only as printed copies inside Linda's own private files, fabricated paperwork designed to justify her actions if anyone ever questioned them later. One current board member, a soft-spoken accountant named Walter Simmons, agreed to speak with Robert directly, once he understood the scope of what had been happening under Linda's leadership. Walter admitted, with visible discomfort, that he had signed several documents over the years simply because Linda presented them as routine administrative matters requiring quick approval. He confessed that he had never actually read most of what he signed, trusting Linda's assurances that everything was standard procedure, a trust that now filled him with quiet horror. Walter's confession became a turning point in Robert's investigation, because it proved definitively that the votes Linda claimed to have received had simply never happened in any legitimate sense. The resolution granting her authority over Michael's supposedly abandoned property existed only because Linda herself had written it, signed for absent board members, and filed it as official record without a single genuine vote ever being cast. Every piece of paperwork Linda had waved so confidently at the police officers that first night was, in the truest sense, entirely fabricated from beginning to end. As Robert compiled this growing mountain of evidence, forged signatures, phantom meetings, fabricated letters, and now a cooperating board member willing to testify to the fraud, Linda's confident public composure began visibly cracking under the pressure. Residents who once avoided eye contact with her at community gatherings now watched her with open suspicion, sensing that something significant was unraveling. Robert advised Michael that with this level of documented fraud, it was time to move beyond a simple property dispute and formally request that local law enforcement pursue a criminal investigation, complete with a search warrant for Linda's home and the official HOA records office she controlled. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the lake house, Robert Ellison stood beside Michael in the county courthouse hallway, waiting for a judge to review the search warrant application built from months of gathered evidence. The judge did not take long to agree, given the volume of forged documents, phantom votes, and corroborating witness statements already assembled. By early afternoon, a team of officers, accompanied by Robert as legal counsel, arrived at both Linda's private residence and the small HOA administrative office she had operated out of for years. What the search revealed inside Michael's own home first, however, struck him harder than any document ever could. Room after room showed signs of quiet, deliberate theft disguised as renovation. Familiar furniture pieces simply gone, replaced with items Linda had apparently purchased herself and billed, absurdly, as necessary maintenance expenses. A painting Michael's late father had given him years earlier, one that hung above the fireplace for as long as he could remember, had vanished entirely, and no one seemed able to explain where it had gone. When confronted about the missing items, Linda's explanation remained astonishingly consistent with the confidence she had shown from the very beginning. She insisted that everything she had done fell under reasonable property maintenance and improvement costs, expenses she claimed the association would eventually be reimbursed for through some vague future arrangement. Robert, standing beside the investigating officers, did not bother arguing the semantics with her directly, and instead simply stated the obvious truth for the official record. What she was describing as maintenance was, under any reasonable legal definition, theft of personal property belonging to someone else entirely. The search of the HOA administrative office produced even more damning material than anyone had anticipated walking in that morning. Filing cabinets contained detailed folders on multiple properties throughout the neighborhood, each one meticulously organized with notes about owner absences, travel schedules, and vulnerability windows Linda had apparently tracked for years. There were folders labeled with residents currently deployed overseas in military service, others belonging to families dealing with long-term medical care for aging relatives, and several more marked simply as extended business travel. Robert flipped through folder after folder in stunned silence, recognizing the scope of what they had stumbled into extended far beyond a single stolen house. Linda had been running what amounted to a quiet, calculated operation for years, identifying vulnerable homeowners through her privileged access to community information and systematically exploiting their absences for personal profit and control. It was not impulsive opportunism, but rather a patient, almost business-like approach to fraud that had simply never been questioned because of the authority her HOA title provided her. Once the scope of the investigation became clear to local authorities, the case moved beyond a simple property dispute and into the hands of the county district attorney's office, given the number of victims and the sophistication of the documented fraud. No federal agencies became involved, since the crimes fell squarely within state jurisdiction, but the district attorney assigned a dedicated team to build a formal criminal case against Linda Harper. For the first time since Michael had returned home to find his life quietly stolen from him, it felt as though the full weight of consequence was finally beginning to move in the right direction. As news of the criminal investigation spread quietly through the neighborhood, the Homeowners Association's board called an emergency community meeting, the kind that had never happened in the community's history before. Word spread fast, and by the evening of the meeting, the small community clubhouse was packed nearly to capacity, residents standing along the back wall when the folding chairs ran out. Linda arrived exactly on time, dressed impeccably as always, still projecting the same unshaken confidence that had carried her through every previous confrontation. She took her usual seat at the head table reserved for the board, and for the first several minutes of the meeting, she spoke as though nothing unusual had happened at all. She framed the entire situation as a misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion, insisting that everything she had done over the years was ultimately meant to protect the community's property values and maintain order among absent homeowners. She reminded the room, with practiced sincerity, that she had dedicated a decade of unpaid volunteer service to this neighborhood, and that surely that history counted for something now. Robert Ellison, sitting quietly near the front of the room beside Michael, waited patiently until Linda finished her speech before standing to address the crowd himself. He connected a small projector to a laptop and began methodically presenting the evidence gathered over the past several weeks, starting with the original property deed and moving steadily through each fabricated document uncovered since. Photographs of the forged board signatures appeared on the screen, followed by scanned bank statements showing cash deposits that corresponded almost exactly with dates. Residents had reported strange tenants in supposedly vacant homes. The room grew progressively quieter as each new piece of evidence appeared, the collective realization settling over the crowd like a slow, heavy weight. Robert displayed the internal HOA folders, documenting tracked absences of military families and residents managing sick relatives. Information that should have remained private but had instead been weaponized for personal gain. Several residents visibly recoiled at the sight of their own family names listed inside Linda's meticulous surveillance files, their absences and vulnerabilities cataloged without their knowledge or consent. It was at that moment that a man near the middle of the room slowly rose to his feet, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed the crowd directly rather than the board. He identified himself as a resident who had returned from an extended deployment 2 years earlier to find his own locks changed and unfamiliar belongings inside his house, an experience he had never reported out of confusion and fear of retaliation. He explained that Linda had convinced him at the time that some clerical mistake had occurred, and that he had simply accepted her explanation rather than risk conflict with someone who controlled the entire community's governance. His admission broke something open in the room, and almost immediately a woman near the back stood up as well, her voice cracking as she described a nearly identical experience from 3 years prior. Then came a third resident, an older man who had stayed silent for years out of fear that speaking up would result in unfair fines or harassment from the association Linda controlled so completely. One by one, more residents rose to share fragments of their own stories, each account adding another layer of confirmation to what Robert had already proven through documentation alone. Linda sat frozen at the head table as story after story unfolded around her, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to visibly disintegrate in front of the very community she had spent years controlling. The confident smile she had worn walking into the meeting had vanished entirely, replaced by something closer to panic, as she realized there was no longer any narrative she could construct to explain away what the room was witnessing collectively. For perhaps the first time in a decade, Linda Harper had absolutely no one left standing in her corner. In the weeks following the emergency community meeting, the wheels of formal consequence began turning steadily and without mercy for Linda Harper. The Homeowners Association Board, now fully aware of the depth of her fraud, voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president, stripping her of the authority she had abused for so many years. Shortly afterward, Michael, together with several other affected homeowners who had finally found the courage to come forward, filed a joint civil lawsuit against her for damages, theft, and years of documented harassment. Simultaneously, the county district attorney's office moved forward with formal criminal charges based on the extensive evidence Robert had compiled and handed over to investigators. Linda faced charges including unlawful occupation of private property, forgery of official documents, and grand theft related to the personal belongings taken from Michael's home and at least 2 other properties identified during the investigation. The scope of the charges reflected not a single impulsive mistake, but a sustained, calculated pattern of exploitation stretching back several years. As the civil case proceeded through mediation, the court ordered Linda to immediately vacate Michael's property and formally relinquish any claim to residency there, a ruling that arrived with very little resistance given the overwhelming documentation against her. Beyond simply leaving the house, the court also ordered financial restitution, requiring Linda to compensate Michael for the value of missing personal belongings, including the painting his father had given him years before its disappearance. She was further ordered to cover a significant portion of the legal fees Michael had incurred fighting to reclaim what had always legally belonged to him. On the day Linda was required to formally vacate the property under court supervision, 2 officers arrived to ensure the transition occurred without incident, standing quietly near the driveway as she gathered her remaining belongings. Michael watched from a respectful distance as she carried boxes to her car in silence. The confident, commanding woman from that first night, now reduced to something smaller, quieter, entirely diminished. There were no dramatic speeches this time, no fabricated documents produced with theatrical flourish, only the slow, humbling process of leaving behind a life built on lies. Before climbing into her car for the final time, Linda paused and turned back toward the house, her eyes scanning the property one last time in a way that seemed almost mournful. She glanced briefly toward the small cluster of neighbors who had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from quiet satisfaction to lingering unease. Not a single person in that group met her gaze with anything resembling sympathy, and after a long moment, she simply looked away and got into her car without another word. As her SUV disappeared down the gravel road for what would be the last time, something in the atmosphere around the lake house shifted almost immediately, a tension lifting that had settled over the neighborhood for years without most residents even realizing it. Michael stood at the edge of his driveway, watching the dust settle behind her taillights, feeling a complicated mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something close to grief for the version of coming home he had once imagined. Later that same afternoon, once the officers had departed and the neighbors had quietly returned to their own homes, Michael finally stepped through his own front door for the first time, in what felt like an entirely different lifetime. The house that greeted Michael when he finally stepped inside felt both familiar and strangely foreign at the same time, a place he recognized in its bones, but barely recognized in its details. The navy blue paint job on the exterior still needed to be undone eventually, but standing in the entryway, what struck him most were the smaller absences scattered throughout the rooms. Shelves that once held books collected over years stood half empty, replaced with unfamiliar decorative items Linda had apparently favored, and the warm wooden furniture he remembered had been swapped for pieces that felt sterile and impersonal. Over the following months, Michael dedicated himself patiently to restoring the house to something resembling the home he remembered before everything had been taken from him. He repainted the exterior back to its original warm sandy color, working weekends alongside a small crew he hired from a nearby town, watching the transformation slowly return the house to itself layer by layer. He replaced the missing furniture piece by piece. Some items ordered new, others found secondhand with a character that felt closer to what had originally filled these rooms. Word of the case had spread throughout the community by then, and slowly, almost hesitantly, neighbors who had remained silent during Linda's years of control began approaching Michael individually to apologize. Grace Whitfield was among the first, stopping by one afternoon with a small basket of vegetables from her garden, admitting quietly that she wished she had spoken up sooner instead of waiting until Michael's situation forced the truth into the open. Others followed in the weeks after, some bringing small gestures of goodwill, others simply offering honest words of regret for years of collective silence that had allowed Linda's behavior to continue unchecked. The community itself began rebuilding as well, holding a formal election for new homeowners association leadership just 2 months after Linda's removal, an election that drew far more resident participation than any meeting in recent memory. The new board, led by Walter Simmons, despite his earlier involvement in unknowingly signing fraudulent documents, moved quickly to implement stronger transparency measures across every level of association governance. New bylaws required independent verification for any decisions involving property status, mandatory recorded votes for all resolutions, and strict limitations on any single board member's authority over resident properties. Michael, drawing on his professional background as an architect, volunteered his own time to help the new board redesign the association's record-keeping systems, ensuring that no single individual could ever again quietly manipulate meeting minutes or fabricate resident absences for personal gain. He helped establish a digital archive accessible to all residents, transparent and impossible to alter without a documented trail, a small but meaningful safeguard against the kind of quiet exploitation the community had endured for years without realizing it. In many ways, rebuilding these systems became its own form of healing for Michael, transforming his ordeal into something protective for the neighbors around him. For his own property, Michael made changes that went beyond simple restoration, determined never again to leave his home vulnerable to the kind of quiet theft he had experienced. He installed a completely new security system, cameras positioned at every entry point, connected directly to his phone regardless of where in the world he might be traveling. He organized every piece of ownership, documentation, deeds, tax records, insurance policies, both physically in a secured safe and digitally across multiple backed-up locations, ensuring that proof of his ownership could never again be questioned or denied by anyone. He also made a quiet, personal promise to himself that the house would never again sit empty for such an extended stretch of time without some form of trusted oversight. He arranged for a close friend from a neighboring town to check the property regularly whenever future travel called him away, a simple safeguard that felt almost unnecessary now, yet one Michael understood the true value of more deeply than most people ever would. Standing on his restored porch one quiet evening months later, watching the sun set gold and orange across the familiar lake water, Michael finally allowed himself to feel something he had been waiting a long time to feel again: genuine peace. Linda Harper had once believed that his absence alone would be enough to make the house hers, that enough time and enough confidence could quietly rewrite the truth of who a home truly belonged to. But a house is never simply defined by who happens to be holding the keys at any given moment. It belongs to the name recorded in ink at the county courthouse, to the person who carried its weight through every season, present or not, and in the end, it was the truth itself, patient and unshakable, that finally opened that door again.